think it happened. They lived way outside of Aurora, and she just remembered that sometime after this event, some guy rode by on horseback and told her father this story about this spaceship crashing and this little non-human, I guess, or whatever. And her father laughed and said, "Oh, I don't Judge Proctor, he's such a joker." And based on that, then up until the day she died, she said it was a hoax. Okay, now, the thing is, in 1973, Robbie Hansen was one of 3 people still living from that period. The other was Mary Evans. And she said she was about 15 at the time, and I spoke with her. According to her own story, she had no direct first-hand knowledge herself, because she said she heard this explosion and everybody was wanting to run into town, and she wanted to run into town, but her parents wouldn't let her. But they went, and then they came back and told her about people there picking up all these pieces and that all this stuff had happened. So she said, yes, it happened, although she had no direct knowledge. Now, the one person I spoke to, Charlie Stevens, had a good reputation there. He lived in that area for a long time. He, of course, they're all dead now. But I talked to him. He was reticent to talk. I had to talk to him through the screen door at his house. And at first, he really didn't want to talk. But, you know, being from this area and being an old Texas boy, I was able to, you know, socialize, as we say. And pretty soon, he was talking. And come to find out, he was about 13, 14 years old. And he had been out with his father early that morning taking care of the business on the farm. And he said he saw the thing go over. And he said he had the impression he was in some sort of trouble because it was like coughing and spitting and sputtering. And then, a little bit later, they heard this explosion, and he looked up and saw smoke coming up from the town. And naturally enough, he wanted to run in town and see what had happened. Now, what he told me next strikes me as totally truthful, because if Charlie Stevens was making up a story, he'd have said, well, I went to town, I saw this little green man, I saw this and that and the other thing. He said his father told him, no, son, we have to finish the chores. Believe me, if you were living in this area in 1897, if you didn't do the chores, you didn't eat. So that, to me, was a very, very truthful and realistic statement. So he didn't get to go into town. He said the next day, his dad went into town and came back and told him about all these people that had these pieces of the wreckage and that they were still hauling pieces of the wreckage away. He said, but his dad never did mention the pilot. And he said he was almost grown before he heard the stories about the little dead pilot. And of course, he didn't know anything about that because he didn't see that, and his dad hadn't told him about it. Again, this strikes me as being very truthful, because I'm sure Charlie Stevens' dad was like a lot of the people that still live up in rural Denton County and Wise County. These are people with their feet firmly on the ground, old-time farmers. They're not given to fights so fancy, and most of the time they're not going to talk about something unless they know it to be true. So according to this story, by the time Charlie Stevens' dad goes into town, they've already buried the pilot. So something tells me that they probably told him about this pilot, but he didn't see it for himself, so he doesn't go spread stories about it. Okay? That strikes me as a realistic aspect of the story. So in 73, there were 3 people. One says it's a hoax, but she had no direct knowledge, according to her own story. The other one said, yes, it did happen, but she had no direct knowledge. This was based on what her parents told her. And then you got Charlie Stevens, who actually saw the thing, heard the explosion, and then heard the account from his father. And this is the story that appeared in the Dallas Times-Herald about Charlie Stevens. He said it was very low and just went straight ahead until it crashed at a well site on a high hill on Judge J.S. Proctor's farm. He said there seemed to be an explosion and a fire that lit up the sky for several minutes. And the next day my father rode a horse into Aurora to look at the scene and said it looked like a mass of torn metal and burned rubble. And then I interviewed Brawley Oates. This was a picture of him taken in 1973. You can see he had some health problems. And he and his wife both swore to me that it was because of radiation from the well, because according to the story, when the crash occurred, they dumped a lot of this debris down the well. And when Brawley Oates bought the property about 1940, one of the first things he did was clean out the well. And they just went down there and cleaned everything out and threw it all away. What happened to it? Nobody seems to know. But he had heard the stories, and when they began to have health problems, he blamed it on the well. The scientific study that was done last summer by UFO hunters, they went down in the well. They actually managed to open the well up. It had been concreted over for years, and there was a little brick well house sitting on top of it. They moved the well house, they opened the well, went down in there, and could find no significant traces of radiation. So that kind of puts to rest the idea of the radiation. But they swore up and down there was something going on there. The key to it is that the Oates family has owned that property since 1940, and that there's been no significant explosion on that property since then. Oates said a lot of people had come to his property to inspect the well site, and he acquired the property in 1945, and he thought it was radioactive, just what I told you, and that they haul all the junk away. This is the front of the Aurora Cemetery with the Texas historical marker. And then when we did our study in 1973, we found some pieces of metal at the crash site. And some of it was quite obviously old pieces of chain or old pieces of nail, and we didn't bother with that, but we did find some little globules of, it looked like fused aluminum or something. We thought it was kind of odd. So we sent them up to study at North Texas at the physics department, I suppose. And they said one of the pieces was very puzzling because although it showed it was composed of 90% iron, it had no magnetic properties. Put a magnet to it, it wouldn't stick. Pretty odd. Now, of course, today, Tom has had a long career in academia. I'm probably looking forward to his retirement, and he's backpedaled somewhat and says, well, you know, we really didn't know what it all was, you know. Okay, that's what most scientists will do. That's why a doctor will never tell you, you know, this is it for sure, and we can do this for sure. They always hedge, right? That's why they say doctors are practicing. That, but it is kind of odd. And then, of course, the Dallas Morning News story. So, today, the best debunking argument today is that since you can't deny that the stories were in the Dallas and Fort Worth papers, now the debunkers say, well, it was just a hoax story. Just planted in the newspaper to draw attention to Aurora because it had been bypassed by the railroad, and they wanted, you know, people to start noticing Aurora. Well, okay, that makes some sense, and I listened to that seriously for a good number of years, until about 3 or 4 years ago, when I went and got the entire front page of the Dallas Morning News for April the 19th, 1897. Right in the middle of the page is a little article about Aurora, windmill demolishes it. These two columns over here are nothing but ads. And then all the rest of the columns, there are 16 stories on this front page, and they came from correspondence. Let me explain this to you. Back in 1897, newspapers were not an operating business. Usually the newspaper was put out by the local printer who had a printing press, and they certainly didn't have the money to hire staffs of reporters. So what they had was what they call correspondence. I know this because in the 1960s, when I attended North Texas University, I got to get it right. It was the University of North Texas then. Now it's North Texas University. No, it's the other way around. See, I'm still confused, and I still haven't figured this one out. So I went to North Texas University, but now it's the University of North Texas. Okay, whatever. I also worked for the Denton Record-Chronicle. What was my job? Opening the letters from the correspondence from all the surrounding little bitty towns, and then I would put their information all together in the news columns that went into the Record-Chronicle. History Mrs. Sam Bloomford visited relatives in Dallas last weekend. A good time was had by all. All that important stuff. And also covered sports. So see, it wasn't even in the 1800s, as far up till the 1960s, and probably even maybe still today. A lot of the times that smaller newspapers get their information is through their correspondence. So all of these 16 stories came not from some professional staff, but from correspondents from all of these various towns. And these towns, these stories range from southern Oklahoma to almost Austin, Texas. And they're all talking about the silver cigar-shaped object flying through the skies. Here's another one I like. Wortham, Freestone County, Texas, April 13th. Captain John A. Lilly, a prominent and reliable citizen of this place, a Mexican war veteran, claims he saw the mysterious airship last night at 9:30. He said it was going straight up. Oops, that leaves out a meteor, doesn't it? I've never seen a meteor go straight up. So, the whole front page, which by the way, I have some copies of these back there if anybody wants to buy one. I'll sell you one for $1. I've got to pay for my gasoline to get it. And then these stories are all in there. And some of these stories you're going to find real interesting because at least 2 of the stories, no, 3 of them I think, are the accounts of people who said they actually encountered the things on the ground and they talked to the crew. In fact, this is not in my presentation because it was in the microfilm of the old Fort Worth Record and I could kick myself for not, I went back looking for the Aurora spaceship crash and I found all these other stories. For example, there's a story from a little town out just west of here and it was quoting the town mayor, the judge, police chief, you know, reputable, credible members of the town, and they said they saw this thing going over at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. Well, of course, that doesn't sound like much to us today, but let me tell you, in those same newspapers was a big article about a new train service that they were getting ready to institute up in the Northeast, and they said they would attain speeds greater than 40 miles an hour. And right there with this notice was a big article citing prominent medical authorities who in 1897 said, the human body cannot withstand speeds greater than 40 miles an hour. So when these people said that something went over going more than 100 miles an hour, that would be the equivalent of us saying something went over there and is going more than 1,000 miles an hour. You know, it's just going faster than anything they could even conceive of. But the story that really got me, and when you read these stories about these encounters with the crew and of this airship, and the stories change. One story, they were told that this was developed in a secret lab in New York and that they took it out for a spin, and the next thing you know, they were over Kansas and they said, well, we're really working great, let's go on down to Texas. Another story said that they came from a hidden civilization at the North Pole, but the common denominator among these stories is they all said, don't tell anybody that you've seen us. This is a secret mission. And of course, these people they told it to, first thing they did was run to town and tell the correspondent, guess what I saw? But the one that really got me, and I think this may give us a little bit of insight into the reality of the UFOs. But before I tell you this, let me explain something to you. If you've read any of the UFO literature, you'll know that when the UFO comes over, the cars stop. Oh, thank you. There's a message to remind us all to turn off our cell phones. And come think of it, I think I'll do the same thing. Appreciate that. So we all know that when the UFO comes over, the car stops, right? And when the UFO goes away, the car starts again. Except, think about it. Nobody ever says, turn on the ignition and the car started. No, it just stopped, and then the UFO goes away and it starts again. Well, this tells us that, and what we are now finding out and realize, and I'm in touch with some very, very cutting-edge, prominent physicists and scientists, we are dealing with energy fields here. And when you can create an energy field that cancels out gravity, then we are finding that gravity and time are interconnected. So in other words, when the energy field comes into play, and the UFO is hovering overhead, then time within that energy field has stopped. So the pistons in your car doesn't turn off, they just stop. And when the energy field goes away, they go back to banging. And I had this tentatively confirmed to me because I was talking about this one night, I think on Coast to Coast. And I got an email from a truck driver. He said, well, I'm not sure about that. He said, me and my buddy was driving our trucks, and we saw this UFO, and it came right over and said, but our trucks didn't stop. So I wrote him back, and I said, well, yeah, but you were probably driving diesels, weren't you? And he said, yeah. Well, diesels run on compressed gas. They don't run on electrical current like cars do. So to me, that confirmed the whole thing. So the electric stopped, all right? So now all of a sudden we've got a whole added thing here, which is time. And if you'll think about it, those of you who've read the literature of the UFO researchers and experiencers, they talk about missing time. They say, well, I saw this UFO at 6 o'clock, and I didn't get home till 7, but my house is only 10 minutes away. Missing time. That's because when they're in the energy field, time has stopped for them. And this also explains some of these people who claim to have been abducted. And they say, you know, I went to bed and I saw these things in my room. The next thing I know, I'm back in my bed. But then they tell this whole long story about how they were taken here and taken there and put on the table and did all this stuff. Well, that's because they brought them back pretty quick to the time they took them, and there's missing time in there. So we've got time involved here. And so this leads me to the next story that I saw, confirm the whole thing. So the electric stopped, all right? So now all of a sudden we've got a whole added thing here, which is time. And if you'll think about it, those of you who've read the literature of the UFO researchers and experiencers, they talk about missing time. They say, well, I saw this UFO at 6 o'clock, and I didn't get home till 7, but my house is only 10 minutes away. Missing time. That's because when they're in the energy field, time has stopped for them. And this also explains some of these people who claim to have been abducted. And they say, you know, I went to bed and I saw these things in my room. The next thing I know, I'm back in my bed. But then they tell this whole long story about how they were taken here and taken there and put on the table and did all this stuff. Well, that's because they brought them back pretty quick to the time they took them, and there's missing time in there. So we've got time involved here. And so this leads me to the next story that I saw in the microfilm that really kind of, I think, tips us off to something. It seems a track inspector from Fort Worth was going up about the same time period, April 1897, was going up this inspecting track, and it started getting dark, so he decided he better turn back, head back, when he saw a big bright light up ahead. So he went up to see what was going on. He said a big silver cigar-shaped object was sitting on the tracks. And he said there was some crewmen around it in uniforms, but nowhere in the story does he make any comment about, apparently to him, they didn't look any different than anybody else, because he doesn't say that they weren't human or anything. It's just a crewman, and they were in uniforms, and he talked to the captain. And the captain said, don't tell anybody that you saw us, because we're on a secret mission. He said, oh, what are you doing? He said, we're going to Havana. We're going to bomb Havana. Bomb Havana? And this is in the spring of 1896. The Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, San Juan Hill, did not start until a year later, 1897, with the explosion of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. How did these guys, whoever they were, how did they know we were going to be in a war in Cuba a year before the battleship Maine blew up? They've got access to time. Fascinating stuff. And all of this was happening long before the Wright brothers ever flew. And before somebody says, oh yeah, but maybe it was a powered balloon. No, because the first recorded powered balloon flight in the United States was the California Era, which lifted off in early 1903, same year that the Wright brothers flew. There was nothing man-made in the air. Now, while I was doing this little documentary I did on Aurora and lashed me with a wet noodle, I've only got like one copy left. I don't have the ability to make more copies. You know, I should have brought a stack of them up here for you guys, but I was making this documentary, and we were filming at the Wise County Courthouse, and Brian Rust and his small child came up and, you know, curiosity. He said, what are you guys doing? And I said, well, we're making a documentary about that spaceship crash in Aurora. He said, oh, I know all about that. He said, my grandfather was there and he told us all about it. So I said, oh, really? Here, sign this. So I got him signed while it was released, and I set him right down, and we did a nice interview. And basically, his grandfather's story is that they had all heard this. He was out working with some guys, and they heard this big explosion. Now, today, we have sonic booms, and I don't know, any of y'all live over the west part of the county. I live about 15 miles from Bridgeport, and they're always blowing up stuff over there, you know, busting rock to get that gravel to haul. So every now and then you hear boom, you know, and as long as it's not your house, you don't worry about it too much. But if you think about it, 1897, they hadn't ever heard anything like that. And so when the ground shook and something went boom, they naturally were very curious as to what was going on. So he said his grandfather and these other fellows went running into Aurora, and they basically told the same story, that there was all these people coming from miles around, and they were all picking up pieces and carting stuff off. But he added an interesting tidbit. He said that law enforcement officers from all over the state started pouring into Aurora. I said, well, you know, what did they do? And he said, well, some of them going around saying, okay, folks, come home, you know, nothing happening here, going back to your homes. And the others were loading all this material into wagons and hauling it off. The very first crash retrieval. Now, this will gain significance, as you will see in a minute. So let's jump forward. Many of you probably have never heard of the air raid over Los Angeles on February the 25th, 1942. I'll try to make this brief, but there is a tie-in. On the night of February the 25th, 1942, Los Angeles, in fact the whole West Coast, was in the throes of war jitters, and not without cause. This is February, end of February, so this is like just 3 months after Pearl Harbor. And this was only a month after a Japanese submarine had surfaced and shelled an oil refinery off the coast of California, or actually near San Diego. So the fear of imminent Japanese invasion was not totally unfounded. So on the night of February the 25th, they had just installed and had gotten into operation what was then one of our top secret weapons, radar, when they picked up a flight of airborne objects coming in. I talked to him through the screen door at his house, and at first he really didn't want to talk. But, you know, being from this area and being an old Texas boy, I was able to, you know, socialize, as we say. And pretty soon he was talking, and come to find out he was about 13, 14 years old, and he had been out with his father early that morning taking care of the business on the farm, and he said he saw the thing go over. And he said he had the impression he was in some sort of trouble because it was like coughing and spitting and sputtering. And then, a little bit later, they heard this explosion, and he looked up and saw smoke coming up from the town, and naturally enough, he wanted to run in town and see what had happened. Now, what he told me next strikes me as totally truthful, because if Charlie Stevens was making up a story, he'd have said, well, I went to town, I saw this little green man, I saw this and that and the other thing. He said his father told him, no, son, we have to finish the chores. Believe me, if you were living in this area in 1897, if you didn't do the chores, you didn't eat. So that, to me, was a very, very truthful and realistic statement. So he didn't get to go into town. He said the next day his dad went into town and came back and told him about all these people that had these pieces of the wreckage and that they were still hauling pieces of the wreckage away. He said, but his dad never did mention the pilot. And he said he was almost grown before he heard the stories about the little dead pilot. And of course, he didn't know anything about that because he didn't see that, and his dad hadn't told him about it. Again, this strikes me as being very truthful, because I'm sure Charlie Stevens' dad was like a lot of people that still live up in rural Denton County and Wise County. These are people with their feet firmly on the ground, old-time farmers. They're not given to fights so fancy, and I spoke with her. According to her own story, she had no direct first-hand knowledge herself, because she said she heard this explosion and everybody was wanting to run into town, and she wanted to run into town, but her parents wouldn't let her. But they went, and then they came back and told her about people there picking up all these pieces and that all this stuff had happened. So she said, yes, it happened, although she had no direct knowledge. Now, the one person I spoke to, Charlie Stevens, had a good reputation there. He lived in that area for a long time. He, of course, they're all dead now. But I talked to him. He was reticent to talk. I didn't think it happened. They lived way outside of Aurora. And she just remembered that sometime after this event, some guy rode by on horseback and told her father this story about this spaceship crashing and this little non-human, I guess, or whatever. And her father laughed and said, "Oh, Judge Proctor, he's such a joker." And based on that, then up until the day she died, she said it was a hoax. Okay, now, the thing is, in 1973, Robbie Hansen was one of 3 people still living from that period. The other was Mary Evans. And she said she was about 15 at the time, and